Carlos Villarreal. He's the Executive Director of the Lawyers Guild down in San Francisco. And he's at the University of Texas School of Law graduate. And he's been working in criminal justice reform. So he's going to be speaking, and I'm sure we'll have time for questions. There's also a lot of material back there about Know Your Rights. There's some stuff for students as well as just your general Know Your Rights information. And you can find a lot of stuff online at aclunc.com. That's pretty much it. Carlos.
So, folks, how many people are familiar with the National Lawyers Guild, first of all? Some people. Okay, cool. So I just want to talk a little bit about that and who we are and what we do. We're a bar association, first and foremost, and that's what we've been ever since 1937 or whatever when we started. But we do a lot of programmatic work as well. However, if you are a lawyer or a law student or a legal worker, I encourage you to join the National Lawyers Guild. Are there any legal workers, lawyers, or law students here? Okay, cool. I encourage you to join, and there are some materials from us as well. There's an event coming up on this coming Saturday, actually, but in San Francisco. And there are posters back there for people who are interested. But you can go to www.nlgsf.org. We also actually have a Legal Observer program that is sort of an official National Lawyers Guild Legal Observer program. And it is something nationwide, and it's been around probably since the Vietnam War era, when there were activists who were protesting the war, and then people decided, you know, we really need to watch what law enforcement's doing. And that's the key. That's what we generally do with our Legal Observer program, is we monitor law enforcement at protests. So we're concerned with free speech activity, but we're also concerned with civil disobedience generally, and ensuring that the police don't violate people's rights, because even people who might technically be violating the law still have rights. And our legal observers, it's a whole separate training actually, although I'd love to come back and do one. I think we're going to do one in Davis in a few weeks perhaps, but I don't have the specifics of that yet. But there are a lot of things that people can do, and so maybe towards the end, depending on how much time we have, I can talk a little bit more about how I train legal observers and what I tell them. So I'm going to talk mostly today about encounters with law enforcement. And what do I mean when I say law enforcement? Well, you know, obviously we mean police. Everybody knows there's Sacramento Police, there's CHP, but there's also, right, Capitol Police. A lot of universities have police officers. In the Bay Area, we have BART Police. There's also, of course, the feds, FBI, ICE. So we're really talking about all of these officials, all of these people who have the power to arrest people, to enforce the law. And the other thing that I want to say about law enforcement, before I get into some of the nitty-gritty and the details, is that we know that police officers and law enforcement officers are, what, human beings, right? So that means that they have bigotries, they have biases, they make mistakes. So even giving them the benefit of the doubt, because I'm sure some people would have other words to describe police with, but even if you're like, hey, you know, my brother's a cop and they can be good people, we also have to remember that police can still make mistakes, still have biases just like anybody else, and so we put ourselves at risk quite often if we do certain things when police are around, when they're asking us questions, when they're trying to stop us on the street. And remember that if a police officer, they're just trying to do their best, they got into the force with good intentions, they really think you did something wrong, but maybe the prosecutor who gets your file on her or his desk is going to just say, hell, we're going to try to put this person away for as long as we can. So all along the way through the criminal justice system, there are risks, and there are things that can come back to haunt you depending on how you interact with law enforcement, because what they're often doing is collecting information that's then going to go and it could be potentially used against you, it could be used against somebody that you care about. So we want to be very careful when dealing with law enforcement. And that includes other things, like we don't want to unnecessarily antagonize them. If we're being detained or under arrest, we want to make sure our hands are visible. We don't want to reach for any weapons. We want to be safe, right? Some of that stuff is obvious, but maybe some of it we need to be reminded about. And there's three major kinds of police encounters that I would normally write on a whiteboard or something, but I'll just keep repeating them over and over again. The simplest one is a conversation, and it is pretty low-key. It's kind of down, let's say it's down here. Then there's detention, and that sort of raises the stakes a little bit. And then there's arrest, and that's kind of the high end of things in terms of kind of minimizing what your ability to do things if you're under arrest, right? And also maximizing what the law enforcement officer can do to you. So, conversation. What is a conversation? Well, we're having a conversation. Well, we're not really. I'm just talking to you. But when someone's talking, that's a conversation, right? When a police officer is walking down the street and says, "Good morning," that's a conversation. It could be a simple, really just somebody being friendly, or it could be something more. It could be a law enforcement officer trying to get information, trying to find out something about you or where you've been or what you're doing. So it doesn't mean that you have to answer any questions. And as I'll emphasize over and over again, it's rarely a good idea to answer any questions, regardless of the circumstance. But even in that circumstance, it doesn't mean that you have to answer something that seems pretty simple, like, "Hey, where are you coming from? Did you come from the school up there?" You know, it seems like a normal question. Maybe he's looking for somebody and it's not you, you don't care. But regardless, it may not be a wise decision to answer that question, and at any rate, you don't have to answer that question. So that's a conversation. And the important thing to know is that you don't have to stay where you are. You don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to speak to the officer or with the officer under those circumstances, right? So, what can you do? Can you just like turn away and ignore them and walk away? Well, sure, you can technically. Maybe that's not the best thing to do because maybe that might raise some suspicion in the mind of the police officer. And that's another thing to mention. You know, what I'm talking about here are sort of your rights and what the officers are supposed to do in respecting those rights. All along the way, we should also remember that officers don't always respect these rights. So you need to be safe, you need to use your best judgment about the situation. But in general, if an officer just comes up to you and you're not being detained, right, which is the next level, and you're not under arrest, then you're free to go. You're free to continue on your way. And you can say, "Oh, sorry, I'd really like to keep walking, so is that okay?" And if the officer says, "No, you can't, I need you to stop, you have to stop," or "No, you can't leave," then that's a sign that you're being detained. And officers generally, if they're trained at all, whether or not they've been well trained or poorly trained, they probably have an idea of these things. They may not call them these three things. They'll definitely call it arrest, but they might necessarily not call it conversation. They might not think about all of these triggers in exactly the same way, but they have an idea about all of these things as well. So they're thinking, "Wait, can I force this person to stay?" Hopefully they're thinking that. So when you say, "Am I free to go? I'd like to continue on," then the officer, if you're not really being detained, if they don't have what they need to detain you, should say sure. Or, you know, "Well, I'm not holding you." They might try to hem and haw, they might try some trick, and they might say, "Well, why? I just asked you a simple question. You know, why do you want to know if you can stay?" And then at that point you might say, "Okay, well, I'm going to continue, thanks," and then walk on. And so that's a conversation. And it might just be an innocent thing, right? A little bit later I'm going to go back to, and remind me if I forget, what happens if an officer comes to your door, like an FBI agent maybe, or an officer comes to your door. Because that's similar. It's pretty usually a conversation if the person doesn't have a search warrant, but it raises a few additional questions, right? So, but this is sort of on the street, in a public place. That's a conversation. So if you are being detained, what does that mean? The police officer has to have something more to detain you. Not just some crazy idea that maybe you're doing something wrong. or just trying to find out information from anyone and everyone because, you know, they think somebody somewhere nearby just did something wrong. So when you're being detained, it means that an officer has reasonable suspicion that you have committed a crime, or that you are committing a crime, right? Because if you have contraband, then you're currently committing a crime, right? So if they have that reasonable suspicion, so it has to be reasonable, which means that, you know, they can't say, well, this guy was wearing glasses, so I assumed he had drugs. That's not reasonable, right? That's just nonsense. And it has to be some sort of articulable fact. It has to be something. It can't just be, oh, I had a hunch. You know, I just had a feeling about that person, you know. It has to be, this person was 2 blocks away from this place and they were wearing a hat that was stolen and it has a price tag on it or something. You know, I mean, something like that. Something more has to lead to this reasonable suspicion standard.
This is lesser than
Probable cause, which we'll get to. Yeah. So reasonable suspicion, they have the right to detain you, which means that you have to stay where you are, or that they can keep you where you are for a limited amount of time. How long? It's not clear, but a short amount of time. And about enough time so that they can figure out whether you really are doing something illegal or have done something illegal. And there are certain other things that they can do if you're detained. They can do a search, a very limited search, so a pat-down, which you've probably seen on television before. They might be able to sort of look into a bag that you have on your person, but they can't really do an invasive search. If they feel on your pockets, let's say that they suspect, well, it probably doesn't matter, but let's just say that they suspect you of having a weapon. If they feel along your pockets what feels like a weapon, then they can go into your pockets and see, oh, it's just a toy gun, so this person, I should let this person go, right? But maybe it's a real gun, and then you might raise things to the next level. Or maybe it's an item that looks like drugs of some sort. So, so that's sort of the limited search that they can do under those circumstances, if they have reasonable suspicion. And if they keep you there for a long time, you can ask again, well, can I go now? Because at a certain point, they should let you go. They can't just hold you there forever and trying to get you to answer questions. That's the other thing. Again, they're going to try to ask you questions. That's probably one of the main tools they have at that point, in addition to the pat-down search, to try to figure out whether you really are the person they're looking for, right? Or really are somebody that was involved in some sort of criminal activity. They're going to start asking questions. And as I'll emphasize again and again, it's rarely a good idea, especially if you get to this level where you're being detained, to answer questions from law enforcement. Because you never know how it can be used against you. And it could be used to take you to the next level and arrest you. So at that point you say, I'd really rather not speak to you. Am I free to go now? So that's a typical, that's how you should handle a detention. Another thing you can always say is that you do not consent to a search. So they're going to search, they might have the right to search, it doesn't matter. You can always say, I don't consent to this search. Even if I told you or some trainer told you, hey, they have the right to do a pat-down search. And the officer might just say, I don't care. But you can always say that you don't have the right to search me. Because maybe they don't even have the right to have detained you. In which case, it always helps to say you don't consent. When we talk more about searches later, I'll repeat that. Now, one kind of side note to this is, should you tell an officer your name? If they say, what's your name? It's probably a pretty common question. In California, you actually do not have to tell an officer your name. In some states now, you might. And if you don't, it could be a crime in and of itself. Which means, if you're in another state somewhere where it is a crime not to tell an officer your name if they detain you, and they detain you and you refuse to tell them your name, well then, it doesn't matter what they suspected you of doing, they now have a reason to arrest you. So, you know, you should use your judgment, but in general, you don't have to give a name in California. You might find that there's no reason not to give a name, it really is just sort of your name. Or you might decide you really want to stick solidly to the I'm going to remain silent rule, which is a good rule. But use your judgment. But you don't have to technically, and you don't have to show an ID unless you're driving a car, right? Because again, if you're driving a car, you're supposed to have an ID, regardless of what an officer might be suspicious of. If you can't show them your ID, your other, whatever else they need when you're driving, registration, right? Then that's an arrestable offense. So those are just a couple of exceptions depending on the circumstances. But in general, I'm not going to speak to you. I'd like to move on now. Please let me know when I can go on. So then you might get to arrest. So they find the weapon. They find something that looks like drugs. That's probable cause. That's what they need. So it's a little bit more than just a reasonable suspicion. It's actual facts. They found the drugs. Okay, maybe they're not 100% sure because they still have to go down to the lab and test them. And so somewhere down the road, prosecutors are going to decide whether they have what they need to prosecute you. But at least in terms of putting you under arrest, the officer now has the information she or he needs to arrest you. Probable cause. You have the item. It was the item that was stolen 2 blocks from here. Maybe your story's right that you just borrowed it from somebody and that's the person that stole it, but at a certain point, they might have enough of what they need to say this is probable cause. You're now under arrest. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you can't leave, that they're not going to let you leave anytime soon, that they can actually transport you at that point. When you're detained, they can't transport you anywhere. They can't move you. They can keep you where you are, but they can't move you. If you're under arrest, they can move you, they can book you, and obviously, depending on what the issue is, you can go to jail for a certain amount of time. You have to be arraigned at a certain point, but you might spend the night in jail, you might spend a few nights in jail. So they can also do a much more thorough search. They can search your person, they can search your bags, and actually look through and take out every item and lay it out on the hood of a car. They can search things near you. If you're in a car, they can search, the compartments within arm reach around you. So they can do a lot more at that point if you're under arrest. The other thing that's really important to emphasize again is that if you're under arrest, they're absolutely going to try to ask you questions. And this is where knowing your rights about interrogation is key, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about interrogation. First of all, people often say, well, if they didn't read me my rights, then they don't, then they did something wrong, they did something illegal, let's sue them. It may or may not be true that they have to read you your rights, actually. If they do, that's fine. If they don't, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you then say something to the officer that it's going to be thrown out of court if they try to prosecute you. So regardless of whether you read your rights or not, don't feel like you have, you have to hear those magic words, and if you don't, you have a blank check, right? So always exercise your rights and say, I'm going to remain silent. Once you're under arrest, you should add something else to the I'm going to remain silent. What should you add?
I want a lawyer.
You want a lawyer, right? So if you're under arrest, don't just say that you can just say this, but you also should ask for an attorney. And if you are being charged criminally, then you have a right not just to an attorney, but a right to a free attorney if you can't afford one. So I do not want to speak to you, I'm not going to speak to you, and I would like an attorney that will represent me. And that's all you really should say to police if you're under arrest. Now, interrogation. What is interrogation? Well, it's when you're in a windowless room, right, with a light over your head, and there's 2 cops, and they keep going in and out, one of them smoking. No. It could be that. It could be that. That's a pretty clear sign that you're being interrogated, but it's not always the case, and it's often not the case, right? So interrogation is really just questioning. It's conversation again, but it's not the conversation we talked about here, because now you're under arrest. So it's talking, it's asking questions, and it can be very casual. So I'll go through some examples. Well, one example that I use a lot is, let's say that you're under arrest and a police officer puts you in the back of a cruiser and starts driving to the police station. And you're in the back of the car, you're kind of scared. There's 2 officers in front, and one officer looks back and says, man, it's hot, we're going to open the windows. We can't open your windows, but we're going to open ours, turn on the air condition. It's been quite a week. And you're like, why are you talking to me about this? And then the officer says, how about that rain on Monday though? That was out of nowhere, huh? And then you're like, yeah, that was crazy. The rain on Monday was absolutely crazy. So that sounds like a pretty mundane, if not boring, conversation about the weather. But, you know, something winds its way through the court system. Eventually it finds its way to the courtroom and, well, it actually didn't rain on Monday in Sacramento, but it did rain on Monday in San Francisco, and that's where the crime took place they're accusing you of, and that's another piece of evidence that they can use against you. So that's just an example of how you really have to be careful when you're talking to police officers, especially if you're under arrest, to fully protect your rights. I'm not going to speak to you, I want to speak to an attorney. So what are some other tricks that they might do besides a sort of casual conversation? I'll talk to you, I'll pretend that I'm a police officer and you are a suspect. So anybody can answer how you would answer, how you should answer. Look, you're not a suspect here. Just help us understand what happened, and then you can go home.
Neither are you.
Neither am I?
No, sir.
I don't really want to talk to you. Can I go?
Well, you're under arrest, and no.
I won't say anything. I need a lawyer.
Okay. Well, you don't need a lawyer.
Yes, I do.
Well, are you going to be like this? I'm going to get Officer John back in here.
So what?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Got it.
What's wrong with your memory? We talked about this an hour ago, and I told you that I'm not going to be talking to you.
Are you sure you're a police officer?
I'm definitely not a police officer, but I'm going to try a few more times. So let me try this. Hey, you know, all your friends, they answered our questions, they're gone. They're eating dinner.
Snitches, man. Always think what I do.
They're snitches. Listen, you need to tell me what I need to hear from you.
Okay.
And then you can go home too.
Your house is on fire, your dog's out, and your wife's in bed with the other man. You better go home.
Other answers.
That's a good one.
Sensitive conversation, am I free to go?
You're not free to go, you're under arrest.
For what?
What are the charges?
Well, let's continue to talk. You know, the charges, we're not sure yet. That's why I'm trying to ask you these questions.
No.
I hope they're not serious. I hope they're not serious charges.
What charges are you talking about?
Cuff me and take
You know,
me.
What am I being detained for?
so let's step back just a little bit.
How about that rain last week?
Wait. Go ahead.
How can they arrest you if they don't have any?
So, here's an important point to make about interrogations in police. There is nothing illegal or unconstitutional about law enforcement, about police lying to you. There is something potentially illegal about lying to police officers, and potentially very serious. So you should never lie to police officers.
Bullshit.
You should never, you know, make a false statement to a police officer. Or at least you should be aware that there's a serious risk if you do. So, but law enforcement can. So they might say, look, there's no charges, we're just asking you friendly questions. Or look, you know, we have some charges, but I want to try to figure out if maybe they're the wrong charges. You know, they could say anything. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And so this point again, look, your friends, they already went home and they're eating dinner. Is that true?
I'm going to eat dinner when I get to the county jail.
Who knows?
Yeah,
Who knows if it's true? It's probably not, right? Because, well, it doesn't really matter whether it's true or not, because you should always say the same thing, which is what?
I'm not going to speak to you. I'd like an attorney.
Right. Right. So I'll do one more. Look, if you're not guilty, why don't you talk? I mean, you obviously have something to hide.
I do talk. I'm talking now.
Well, not you, but some other people here aren't. They're obviously the guilty ones.
No, they're not. You're all together.
Then what do they have to hide? What do you have to hide if you're you folks here?
Yeah, that's one friend.
Yeah,
Somebody.
Three of you came in late.
So if you're not guilty, then why are you not? If you're not guilty, then why won't you speak? Why are you
don't
saying,
want
I'm
to
not
tell-
going to speak,
You
I
don't
want
want
to
to
talk to an
tell
attorney?
I
the
choose
judge
not to
that you
speak.
bought dope from us, did you? Do you?
I
Wait.
choose not to speak.
You
know
choose
my
not to speak.
rights.
You know your rights. Okay, but, you know, that sounds to me like you're hiding something.
I've been
Oh, that's
advised by the ACLU not to.
Right.
Can one say, can one say, I'm innocent, I have nothing to say?
Yes, you can.
You can, but you know, I'm trying to think of, there's a great video online where a law professor goes through all the reasons why you should never ever talk to the police ever. And I believe he confronts the, what if you just want to tell them that you're innocent? But I can't remember what it
It was
was.
on Facebook today. So
Yeah.
Oh, was it?
It's a Facebook share today.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a handy video to watch because he really goes into detail about why it's never a good idea to talk to law enforcement. And I think he tackles that issue. But what I would say is, you can say that, but it's probably still just actually better to say, I'm not going to speak to you, I want to speak to an attorney. Because look, if law enforcement is really not interested in you, then saying I'm innocent is not going to change that. Or if they are really interested in you, saying I'm innocent is not going to change that. At a certain point when they're no longer interested in you, they're going to let you go, or they're just going to have an attorney visit you, right?
If you start in,
Do they have to tell you what you're charged with? I think you can gloss over that.
I believe that's a good question. Does anybody else know the answer to that? I believe that they do have to tell you what you're
Yeah.
charged with when they
Yeah.
arrest you. But when you're being interrogated, they can say, well, look, you know, I know that we're charging you, we're going to charge you with this, but you know, I'm concerned that you might be, the prosecutors might try to go for something else. Because ultimately, the decision of what to prosecute you for is up to the prosecutor. And in fact, if you're arrested and the prosecutor decides not to prosecute you at that time, and but they don't dismiss the charges, they could find some other piece of evidence a month later that they say, oh, not only did this person actually, you know, rob the place, they are the person that committed this assault or something down the street. So you can get charged later, and a prosecutor can choose to charge you later with something else. Wait, I thought I saw another hand right here.
Carlos, you started out kind of with the premise on why they would stop you, right?
Uh-huh.
And you mentioned something about a schoolyard. And I'm thinking, well, if 2 blocks from there was a, quote, pedophile report that somebody was hanging out at the playground, and you just so happen to be walking from that vicinity, and an officer was to stop you. Obviously, they have been told, the police officers, an incident just happened. Now, they asked you, you're in every right to walk down the street, but now they ask you, where did you come from, which is what you said. And you mentioned, well, I don't really have to tell them. Now, based on natural biases, which police officers have, and you are a person of color, and you are maybe in a white neighborhood, you know, again and again, the officer is going to stop you, okay? Where at that point do you say, why? As was asked earlier, you don't. Can at that point you exert your right and say, why are you asking me these questions? Now at that point, does the officer has to say, we have a report that something happened a while ago? Does the officer have to say anything at that point?
I don't think so. Not if you're just being detained. Then they're
Well,
just
he's
trying
stopping
to.
you because he's got a call already.
Yeah.
That an incident happened and some neighbors saw it, and you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And they're all paranoid, and there's this black person walking down the street from a white neighborhood school, and why is this person even in my neighborhood? But the officer's gonna stop you, okay? And that person at that point asks, why are you really stopping me?
You can.
Okay?
You can ask why. Why am I being detained? Why are you keeping me here?
Now, being the point that officers can lie, okay, at that point, where can you say, no, I have nothing, I don't know what you're asking me, and I'm going about my business. You know what I'm saying? At that point, I mean, that's what we should do, right? To say,
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I came from I walk by the school when I'm going to my girlfriend's house, or I'm going home, or whatever. How do we get out of there without the officer pursuing, you know, and saying, no, wait a minute, I got a report of a black male harassing some little white girl at the school, and you kind of look like that person. How do you, as a person of color, get out of that?
Well, I mean, I think if your concern is that, you know, if you just say, I'm not going to talk, I'm moving on my way, that's gonna be problematic, right? That's what you're getting at.
That's what I'm saying.
That regardless of whether they would have the right to keep you there or not, that's probably going to push it over the edge for a lot of officers.
Suspicion raises a little bit.
So, I mean, I think that's where you'd use your judgment and you'd say, well, you know, at this point I think I should say, you know, something more. So, look, I'm not the person. I'm going on my way. I was just out of, you know, you can give some information, but you want to keep it as minimal as possible. And you want to try to use the buzzwords of, you know, am I being detained? I need, you know, I'd like to move on now. Am I free to go now? You know, so that you're forcing the officer to sort of figure out a reason, you know, why he's going to keep you there. And unfortunately,
So you want to get to the
that's what
reason
they're
why they
thinking.
really stopped you, if you can. If you can get the police officer.
You can ask, yeah. You can ask.
Well, why are you really stopping me? Or is it just any
You
particular
can
reason?
ask, and you know, see what they say. I mean, it's not clear to me. I don't think that it's necessarily true that they're going to tell you the truth at that point if they're stopping you.
Or that they will lie necessarily. either.
Yeah.
If you start answering some questions, does that open you up to making you answer
No.
other questions?
So if you are being interrogated, let me just answer this question really fast. If you're being interrogated and you start answering questions, you start talking, and then you think to yourself, oh shit, I'm sorry. Oh shoot, I'm supposed to remain silent. What am I supposed to say? Oh, you know, or if you're under arrest, like I'm supposed to say that I want to speak to an attorney. You can still say it. You can invoke your right at any time, and the officers are supposed to stop asking you questions. Somebody back there.
I was just wondering, what town are you from?
From where am I from? Well, our office is in San Francisco,
Oh.
so Bay Area.
Once you've been arrested, and if they choose not to pursue the case, and if the charges have been dismissed with prejudice, can you explain that? My understanding is that they can still pick that charge up again sometime.
Nope.
No?
I think if they've been dismissed, they cannot.
Regardless of...
There's different things that can happen to charges. The prosecutors could choose. If they choose not to prosecute, that doesn't necessarily mean that the charges are dismissed, that they're gone, that they're discharged or anything. It means they have a year or you know more depending on the crime, and they could still charge you with something later, or they could charge you with that crime later at a future date.
Was there a statute of limitations on that?
Yeah, there always is. There always is. People who practice criminal law regularly, does people know what the statute of limitations is?
1 year for a misdemeanor,
1 year
3
for
on a felony.
Yeah.
They have to have new charges.
And federal? Does anybody know about federal though?
Federal's the same, it's 1 year.
Charges are dismissed with prejudice. They can charge you with the same crime, but they have to have new evidence.
Yeah,
That's something else.
that's true. If they dismiss it with prejudice, they have to have new evidence. But like he said, they can still charge it with the same crime.
They can charge you with the same crime.
If it's dismissed,
So at any, I'm sorry, go ahead.
1 year for a misdemeanor and what for a felony?
3 years. 3 years.
3 years?
Most felonies, yeah.
most felonies.
Yeah.
That means-
Why are you asking? And checking your calendar. The question, I believe, was what is the statute of limitations on certain kinds of crimes? Misdemeanors 1 year, felonies 3 years. Most felonies 3 years is what people have said. So there's a lot of questions. I have 2 more questions, so let's get to these.
I'm still stuck on what you were saying, is that, the same thing that I have heard is that once you've invoked your right to be silent, that they've tricked you into talking over something stupid like the rain, that you lost that right unless you re-invoke it. So do you have to re-invoke it, or are you safe because you've said it once?
You should re-invoke it. I think it's the wise thing to do.
Yeah.
You know, that you should re-invoke it if you've already started to speak. I thought the question was, if you just start to speak and then you had not invoked it even once, you should invoke it. You might still be protected, but I think it's a wise thing to re-invoke it because being argued.
Can I reiterate on the rain?
I'm sorry?
Can I reiterate what you just said? Okay, and once the officer has you talking about the rain for your own protection, if the officer, if the crime didn't occur in Sacramento, it occurred in San Francisco, and he got you talking about the rain, continue to talk about the rain. It's raining now. Look, you know, it's still raining. That way he cannot say that you didn't talk about the rain. He can say you talked about rain over and over and over, which is not raining. So the judge will say, well, I'm not gonna let that in because she's talking about the rain. For instance, I bought a car one time. I bought a car that had out of shape plates.
That's good stuff.
It had Nevada plates on it. And for me to buy this car, I had to get it cleared through the police department. So I called the cops, and the cop ran the plates and said the car was not stolen. So I bought the car. The cop right there. 2 weeks later, that same cop, in the same spot where I bought the car at, came and told me, hey man, I got some good news and some bad news. I said, what's the good news? He said, the good news is this car is going back to where it came from. The bad news is you're going to jail. And the same cop arrested me and took me to jail. It said he knew I didn't steal the car, but he can't take me to jail because I had possession of the car. But keep it long story short, it took me 6 months inside the county jail fighting that case to prove my innocence to get out. So they're tricky.
Press just showed me this great card. I think they're back there, right? They're back on the table. And these are handy because we're going through a lot of stuff here, and then there's a lot of complicated questions that come up. But they're simple things of some of what I'm talking about here, and sort of how to invoke your rights and the very basic things to say. So I won't repeat them because we're talking about them now. But I want to talk about searches, and then we can have a little bit more question and answer. As I said before, you never want to consent to a search, whether or not... well, actually, let me step back a little bit. Let me go back to the issue of the police coming to your door. Because that happens a lot. We see it a lot in certain communities, in particular with the FBI coming to people's doors and trying to have a friendly conversation with people. Right? Again, it's like a conversation down here, and it's like an interrogation that we've talked about. And so I think it's important for people to figure out how they would react or think about how they would react if the police or FBI came to their door. And I think the appropriate thing, some of the rules you've already learned, it's very appropriate to apply those rules. So what would you do if the FBI came to your door and they said, how are you doing? We're actually just in the neighborhood. We opened up an office down the street, and we're trying to meet as many people as we can. It's sort of a goodwill gesture the FBI is doing, and we're just they're in they show you a badge, but they're in suits and ties, or maybe even I've heard of FBI officers showing up in like Hawaiian shirts and stuff. So it could be anything. It's but they identify themselves as law enforcement. They're not undercover. They want to talk to you, but they just want to can we come inside and have a conversation, get to know you, get to know us.
I'll come down to your office when I have more time.
You come to our office? Well, better yet, why don't we go, there's a cafe around the corner, we can meet you there tomorrow. How about that? Can we just say we'll meet tomorrow at noon? How about that?
No, when I'm free, I'll just come by the office and say hi.
Come by our office. Okay, well, we don't actually have an office. I was just kidding. No. So you don't want to let officers into your home. You don't want to answer their questions. You can talk to them a little bit, but what I would say in that situation is, do you have a business card? I'll take that, and somebody will contact you later. I don't have time to talk right now. I don't have time to meet with you right now. Okay? Now you don't even have to answer the door technically, because there's just someone coming to your door, right? It could be a salesperson coming to your door, right? But you might want to for various reasons. One, do they have a search warrant? You might not know if you don't open the door, and if you don't, they might open it for you, right? So, of course, they'll usually say something loudly through the door. That's what they're supposed to do. But, so if you do open the door and you're talking to them, what you want to do is just say, oh, well, I'm not going to speak to you. And if you're concerned about them, coming into your home for some reason, or seen something in your home, you can also kind of close the door behind you to make it clear that they're not going to enter your home. If you take a card, that's handy because, especially if it's the FBI, because what we find is that the FBI will do this sort of thing, and it's helpful to then call the ACLU, the National Lawyers Guild, some other civil rights organization in your community, and tell them, these FBI officers came to visit me, they wanted to ask me questions, here's their name and number. And they might even know who these FBI officers are, but a lot of times what we'll find out is that there's a lot of other people who had visits that were similar from some of these same folks. And we'll often call, we'll have lawyers call the FBI, and then the FBI will sort of just say, oh, you know, they won't bother with things anymore because they don't want lawyers involved.
Carl, something CT said, do not lie to a federal agent. If you are not going to go in later, don't say you're going to go in later. Don't lie to a federal officer. It's now a crime.
Yeah.
So don't do that. Say somebody else will contact you. And I've got to say, as far as FBI agents, do remember, though, we are doing an anti-trafficking movement here in town, and we do have 2 FBI agents involved in that. So it is a good idea to get them discarded because he might be, and she might be, investigating the trafficking in Sacramento. So they are going to neighborhoods here because we're a trafficking hub. Humans.
So it is important to think about that, and I'm glad you reminded me of that, and I missed it. But you also think about it in terms of what we talked about earlier, which is, you know, when you have you're stopped on the street by a police officer and you say, "Am I free to go?" You might say something like, "I'd like to go on my way. I'm headed to church," or something, you know, or say something like that. And that's not always a good idea if you really weren't headed to church, right? So it's better to just say something like, "Hey, I'd like to keep going. It's none of your business where I'm going. I'm just going." Right?
How about Homeland Security?
I'm sorry?
How about Homeland Security? They sometimes would come up down from Homeland Security.
It doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't matter what kind of officer they are. You should and can say these things and exercise your rights.
What about JSOC? I made a joke about Joint Special Operations Command.
I know less about them,
Well,
but you know,
don't worry, they're not legal.
people talk about these know your rights trainings and they say, "Oh, you guys are just trying to get criminals out, you know, free or whatever." But then you remind some people like that they're right wingers, right? And then you remind the right wingers, well, do you remember the ATF stuff back in the '90s with Clinton? Those are officers. Anyway,
Well, my example was the military.
Military, yeah. Let me just get through the searches stuff really quickly. So you don't want so if they come to your door, you don't have to talk to them. I went through all that. But what if they do have a search warrant or an arrest warrant? Then you don't want to ever physically resist a search, but you again want to say, "I do not consent to a search." And so if you're presented with a search warrant, it's a good thing to take it, look at it. If you can get a copy of it, great. Take a look at it. It should say where they're going to be searching or what they have permission to search from a judge somewhere, right?
Don't you get a copy?
So if it says, I'm sorry?
Don't you get a copy?
Yeah.
You should get a copy, but I've heard, maybe people know police practices in different places. I've heard sometimes you might and sometimes you might not.
You can they're supposed to give you a copy of what they take from where we're doing the search. The truth is that if they're searching through your house and they don't allow you to watch them search, God knows what they really take. But you can't get a copy of the warrant and what they allegedly took.
And so it might say something like, okay, we have the right to search 29 First Street, first floor. But your office or your place, or maybe it's in an apartment, you know, is on the second floor. Well, so that's important to know. And you can inform them that you're aware of that and that they're not supposed to search your place. Now, will they listen? They might say something like, "Oh, that's just a typographical thing. It's no big deal." But at least assert it, and you know, along with the fact that you don't consent to a search, I don't consent to the search, and not only that, but your warrant says you're not even supposed to be searching this place. It might also say what they're searching for, and that might make a difference in terms of where they're searching. Why do they need to look through my computer if they're looking for stolen car parts, right? Or if they have an arrest warrant, why do they need to look in, you know, my wallet through every little piece of thing if they're just trying to find my roommate?
Are warrants specific or are warrants in general?
No, that's specific.
They're specific,
Specific.
but
We're
I'm not
coming
sure
for
what you mean by
Carlos,
general.
We want to go to Carlos's room.
Yeah,
No
if
need
it's-
to go to Jose's and Mary's room. I guess what I'm.
Right, but there could be a lot of ambiguity, and they're going to try to get away with whatever they can, right? If you don't specify things, if you don't make it clear, this is not this person's apartment, that's their apartment, you know. Now, they still might not listen to you, but they might just say, we're just going to look wherever we can all over this apartment complex for this person that we're trying to find, you know. But you have a pretty high level of protection in your home. It's kind of like the highest protection in terms of privacy rights in this country, your Fourth Amendment rights. It's in your home. It's you know, at the doorstep, right? So it's really you know, there's a really high standard there, and so it's really important to say that you don't consent to a search and to make it clear what even if they have a search warrant, that they're not supposed to be in certain areas, if that's clear from the warrants.
Carlos, it's my understanding that currently in a detention, they can look at your cell phone and they don't need a warrant, they don't need any. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I know that
Considered evidence.
my thinking is that they might consider it evidence. People might know differently from me, but I feel like they were, in some cases, trying to get some sort of warrant to actually download the contents of phones, as opposed to just looking at it. Does anybody have experience with that?
Yeah.
This came up a lot with people being arrested at protests in the Bay Area.
This has a lot to do with our period post 9/11, the fact that they're not respecting the law.
And keep in mind that when
Does the Patriot Act give them the right?
I don't know if that gives them the right, but I mean, you know, they could say that it's evidence. So one of the things that they've said, if they arrest you, first of all, keep in mind that they can pretty much search all of your stuff. They inventory it, and it's called an inventory search, right? So they'll at least take everything, all of your items, and look through them at that point. But in terms of cell phones, it's a little bit new, and I feel like it's a little bit changing in terms of what they can and can't do. So people have more information about that. I think a lot of it's being challenged. It's similar to a lot of the laws about whether you can videotape police officers, right? It's being challenged right now, and you find that we're winning some of them, so that's good. But I think that people, you know, should. There's no reason why. If you're not under arrest, I mean, it's your property, so they don't necessarily have a right to take it anywhere, you know. But if there's something there that could be evidence and it's in your house, sitting on your desk, I suppose they could take that and have some reason for saying why they took it, and then they would download the items from it or take a look at it.
The reality is, they do what the hell they want to do. Yeah. What they can do is really where you get to go after them legally, you know. But the reality is what they're going to do is what they want to do. And we've recently had several cases where we dealt with that, where officers came down from Placer County down to Santa Barbara to arrest one of our people on for violation of parole because he filed lawsuits against Placer County officials and against friends of a Placer County official. So when they got there, even though they were really limited as to what the search warrant really limited them as to what they could do, because they happened to see this folder sitting out with the name of a Channel 13 newscaster on it. They took that folder, and in that folder there were documents that they later used to say that he violated his parole. So even though they weren't part of the search, and even though the search was specific as to his room, and these weren't even in his room, they were in another part of the house, they searched the whole house, even though they weren't given permission to search the whole house. So, and they still got away with it.
It's handy to document what you can. It's good. It's a good idea if you have, you know, if your, I don't know, sister lives down the street, text her, right? Have her come over. The more witnesses you have, the more people you have, the more you can document, the better. You know, what are the names of the officers that came and searched? You know, because there might be 2 people that go to court, but there might have been 4 officers there. You know, so all of that is really important to have and can help protect you. But
yeah, I have 2 questions. One is, do you have a legal right to be able to be present for the search or document supervising? And the other one is, in a search situation, whether it's on your person or in your
think you're legally required to turn them over in that situation. You would probably take a judge ordering you to do that, not a police officer. What was your first question? You should ask. I don't think you necessarily have a right. Police will say there's safety concerns and they can force you to stay in one part of the house or something while they go through the rest of the house. But you should ask, and you should try to say, I should be able to watch what you're doing. So
I think they can take whatever that item is, like they can keep it.
you mean the computer?
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe they have some expert somewhere that can crack it.
But I think you're not required to get those passwords.
Yeah.
Marlo?
Yes.
This might be a good time to think about what you write down. Think about something before you put it on a piece of paper. Think about what you send somebody in an email. Think about what you put on Facebook. Think about what you call somebody on. Think about what you text somebody. If you don't want people to know things, don't text it. Don't email it. Don't tell them on the phone. Don't write it down. Think about what you say to people. Do you really want there to be evidence of what you're saying? I'll tell you, I met with a lawyer yesterday morning. I told her things in person. I would not tell her over the phone. I did not tell her on email. I did not tell her on Facebook. Think about what media you're using to talk to people, because those things are not secure.
Think and be smart, but don't let it. What I hate is when people just sort of shut down and they're not.
Don't do that. But think about how
continue
you do
to
it.
organize.
I told her what I
to.
needed to tell her, but I told her in person. I did not tell her over the phone.
Yeah. So I was going to talk a little bit about legal observing and what we do in terms of legal observing with the Lawyers Guild and how I train people. Some of the things. So. Can I talk a little bit about that, or do people have other questions just about searches or encounters with police?
How about the car?
If somebody is on probation and they live with you, and the police come to do a search, what areas of the house do they have access to? The whole house, or just areas?
They're searching for the person?
No, just kind of doing a.
Probation.
Oh, it's a probationary thing. That's kind of like when you're in probation, there are all sorts of special circumstances. Does anybody know? I would think that it would depend on the terms of the probation.
Yeah, it's supposed to be on terms of probation. In other words, a probation search is supposed to be specific to certain areas. The room that the person is in, or any area of the house where the person frequents a lot, okay? And they really have to be, they're supposed to be specific about it, but 9 times out of 10 they're not going to be. They're just going to look wherever they want to look, and that's where you get them, because if they find something in an area that's where they're not supposed to look, then, you can have that suppressed, that evidence suppressed, usually.
You were going to say something?
I was going to say, if you have a roommate and they're being searched, whether it's because the police have a warrant or whether they're just a parolee or a probationer, they're only supposed to be able to search their room and any common areas. But if you have your own room, they're not supposed to be able to go in there.
Yeah, because your rights sort of connect to you and your space, right? And the other person, they have their deal. So yeah. And then somebody over here had a question.
But the police want to stop you and they want to search your car.
Well, you have slightly lesser rights in your car versus your house, right? Because it's a vehicle, it's out on the road, you have to get it licensed. There's big giant windows all around it, right? And so you have somewhat lesser expectation of privacy, or maybe you have a really high expectation, but you're not supposed to. So police can stop you for a number of reasons on the road. They can ask for your license if you're the driver. They can actually ask everybody for a license. It doesn't necessarily mean that people have to show them a license if you're not the driver. But nonetheless, they can search if they think that you might have, they can search around you for safety reasons. But if, I've seen this many times on it seems like a very common thing on cops, right? Where they ask people to search a car, and then it comes down to are they going to consent or not? And I think you would say the same thing. I don't consent to this search, and they might still search. but at least you said you don't consent to it. And so what happens, and you said, you said the thing about suppression is that hopefully if they find something in your car that is evidence of wrongdoing, evidence of, breaking the law, drugs or something, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't yours, it's probably your friends, but they when you go to court, that could potentially be suppressed, in which case it wouldn't come into evidence in your case. And if that happens, it's very likely, let's say it's a key piece of evidence, it's the contraband, well, then it's very likely that the case will get dismissed. You're not going to have, it's not going to be successful. So that's the usual remedy when police violate a lot of these rules.